Hopeful view of the Mugabe victory.
Haven't you got any brains in your head to know what you've done?
How do you feel about Mr. Mugabe's victory?
I think it stinks, and the British stink with it because you've just given a victory to bloody Russia, you idiot.
Bishop Muzorewa's supporters showed real anger. They wouldn't let anyone else near their headquarters, and there were a few violent incidents. They claim they've been cheated as much by Britain as anyone else. Later in the day, lorries set off into the suburbs packed with the bishop's men who went on the rampage, attacking anyone they thought might have been a supporter of their rival, Mr. Mugabe.
The Prime Minister said today statements made by Mr. Mugabe following his election win should encourage Rhodesians and the world community. Mr. Fraser said the African leader had spoken of the need for peace and stability and of his determination to uphold the Rhodesian constitution.
I've sent Mr. Mugabe messages today, and you will have heard what was said in the Parliament. He does need to be congratulated on what was a resounding electoral win. And one of the things that I think we need to have in mind, the processes for the election were established. About 93% of the people voted. They've been judged free and fair. And Mr. Mugabe has won the election. Now, whether people support Mr. Mugabe's personal political philosophy or not, he has been judged by the people of Zimbabwe as the person that they want to run the government. And against that background, if we have the kind of confidence that we ought in the democratic process, the judgment has certainly got to be respected. And therefore, Mr. Mugabe congratulated on what's plainly a very significant electoral win.
An announcement on cuts in income tax is expected from the federal government tomorrow. The Treasurer, Mr. Howard, is to make a statement on the economy in Parliament late tomorrow morning.
There's been no comment from the Treasurer on what he will be announcing tomorrow, but I'm told that Cabinet decided yesterday there should be tax cuts paid for out of the government's windfall revenue from oil. The government's gathering hundreds of millions of dollars extra as oil prices rise, but just how much of this money will be handed back to taxpayers is not yet clear, nor is the timing, though a logical starting date would be July the 1st, so that tax cuts would apply over a full financial year. Government sources say the aim is to provide tax relief across the board, with the most benefit going to those on the lower end of the income scale. I'm told the most likely way this could be achieved is by raising the tax-free threshold, at present $3,893 a year, so that people can earn more dollars before having to pay tax on them. This would give a proportionately greater saving to those on low incomes. Another benefit from the government's point of view is that this would retain to some extent the concept of indexation, to which the government remains committed. Against that approach, there's been pressure on Cabinet from government backbenchers for the oil money to be spent on higher family allowances and on relief for single income and other disadvantaged families. But by spreading tax cuts across the board, the government could expect the maximum political advantage in an election year. Duncan Fairweather, Canberra.
The Prime Minister said today 2 officers from his intelligence branch, the Office of National Assessments, had leaked information on Afghanistan for use by the opposition.
The Prime Minister revealed the action by ONA officers during an answer to Parliament, in which he said evidence today indicated the Soviet Union was using chemical weapons in Afghanistan. This follows a series of press reports of alleged differences over Afghanistan between Mr. Fraser and ONA headquarters, and a report today that the office had censored information on Russian use of nerve gas. Mr. Fraser rejected the allegations that the intelligence office had withheld information. He then revealed what he described as a serious situation, with the 2 officers admitting they'd knowingly supplied material for Mr. Hayden's speech. The Prime Minister quoted some of the information alleged to have been supplied, and this strongly supported Mr. Fraser's often stated views on the blatant aggression of the Soviet invasion. He and the Director General of the ONA considered the actions to be ill-judged and damaging, and a move against the officers was up to the Director General. Any repetition of these events in any branch of the public service, Mr. Fraser said, would do real harm to the apolitical nature of the service. Mr. Hayden said later that Mr. Fraser's statement was a most serious challenge to the Parliament. It could only be interpreted as a blanket prohibition on any contact between the public service and the Parliamentary Library and research staff. There was no suggestion of any leakage of classified information, Mr. Hayden said. The mere fact of contact was the point of the Prime Minister's objection. Graham Dobell, Canberra.
There's a prospect of further industrial unrest in the oil industry as New South Wales petrol supplies dry up. Sydney's petrol tanker drivers are to meet on Friday to consider industrial action. The ABC's industrial reporter Bob Worth says the immediate future of Sydney's fuel supplies looks grim.
Following yesterday's indefinite strike by Shell's storemen and packers, queuing for petrol was the order of the day in Sydney today. The storemen and packers want the right to man the Sydney to Newcastle fuel pipeline and want payment for delegates who have held meetings on the issue. 1/3 of Sydney's petrol pumps are now dry, according to the Service Stations Association. In a survey today, the association found that another third of the city's service stations were closed to conserve fuel stocks for later in the week, while the remaining third were open, with queues building up all the time. Mr Alf Parker, the president of the association, says oil companies just cannot keep an adequate supply of petrol. He said an overtime ban by storemen and packers wasn't helping the situation either. A second dispute in the oil industry blew up at the Amoco terminal at Banks Meadow in Sydney today when Amoco drivers met to consider a federal court order against secondary boycotts. The federal court ordered the Amoco drivers to drop their boycott against an independent fuel distributor at Leppington. The controversial legislation, which prevents unionists from boycotting businesses other than their own employers, is currently causing ferment in trade unionism generally. So the Amoco delegates today decided to widen the issue and sought an emergency meeting of all oil industry transport delegates at the union's transport house in the city. Transport union delegates met here for 2 hours this evening and decided that Amoco drivers would go back to work tomorrow. Amoco drivers have been on strike for the last 8 days. However, the delegates decided that all tanker drivers in Sydney would hold a stop work meeting on Friday over the controversial secondary boycott issue. And so the prospects for more industrial unrest in the oil industry at the moment seem to be very great indeed. From the Transport Workers Union headquarters in Sydney, Bob Worth reporting.
Still to come in tonight's bulletin, call for a change in our approach to drug problems. Former Chief Stipendiary Magistrate Mr Murray Farquhar denies links with organised crime. And overseas, the latest in the American presidential primaries. Also, special reports from the ABC's Paul Lockyer at Khmer Rouge headquarters in Kampuchea. And Peter Monkton on Bidong Island off Malaysia. His subject, Goodwill Turns to Black Market. The first Pan-Pacific Conference on Drugs and Alcohol closed in Canberra today with a call for a major change in Australia's approach to drug problems. The national body, the Australian Foundation on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, said it would give urgent emphasis to reducing demand for drugs rather than fighting supply.
The new approach aimed at educating people to withstand pressure and live a normal life without drugs is partly an admission that stronger laws haven't stopped drug abuse. The Executive Director of the Drug Foundation, Mr Pierre Stoltz, said some experts believed increased drug controls had only encouraged the black market.
Well, I think that from what we have learned in the 70s, where we have essentially tried to use law enforcement as a means of drug control, also try to eliminate supply and try to educate children about alcohol, drugs and so on. In the 80s, I think that we're going to try to reduce demand as well. In other words, we're not going to try to eliminate what we have, certain of the things that we have done in the 70s by reducing supply, but we also are going to try to reduce the demand in the community by rallying the community behind the projects that we propose in the next few years.
The former Chief Stipendiary Magistrate of New South Wales, Mr Murray Farquhar, is undecided whether he should resign as Chairman of the Drug and Alcohol Authority. The opposition leader, Mr Mason, told State Parliament yesterday that Mr Farquhar had been involved in a 2-year scandal over his open links with organised crime. Today, Mr Farquhar talked to Richard Palfreyman.
Do you, as the opposition has alleged, have friends in criminal circles?
Certainly not. It's patently absurd. And the remarkable thing is that in the 18 years that I served as a stipendiary magistrate, there was never one complaint about me or my handling of cases. And I think certainly the opposition would acknowledge, while they were in power, that there was never any. So that's what the first 14 years of my service as a stipendiary magistrate. It is nonsense.
And how do you react to the suggestion made in Parliament yesterday that you should now retire from your part-time position as chairman of the Drugs and Alcohol Authority?
Well, this is a mixed situation. I'm quite appalled by this. I know that my family are deeply hurt. One doesn't know what people will do. I'm torn between two feelings. I don't propose to make up my mind in any hurry. As I see it, if I were to retire from that now, which incidentally isn't terribly financially rewarding, let me hasten to say, and that's not important. I've been doing it because I've had a genuine interest in people who are affected by the abuse of both alcohol and drugs, and it's not a recent interest. I've exhibited that over many, many years and have written many papers on it. Whether I was correct in things I said, that's beside the point. But my feeling is to say, yes, let me get out of the thing. But some people might interpret that as like a whip cur with his tail between his legs.
An implication of guilt, perhaps?
Well, that's right, and I certainly am not that.
Mr Mason has agreed to provide police with all the information in his possession concerning the allegations against Mr Farquhar. In Parliament today, the Premier, Mr Rand, said Mr Mason would be a despicable coward unless he produced the information he claimed would back up his allegations. Late this afternoon, Mr Mason issued a statement saying he would pass on to the Police Commissioner all available information on the drug case in question. In the American presidential primaries, Senator Edward Kennedy has scored his expected home state win over President Carter in Massachusetts. But in neighbouring Vermont, the President turned the tables on his challenger. On the Republican Party side, Congressman John Anderson of Illinois has produced a double-barrel surprise, putting up a strong showing against the party's frontrunners in both states. On last report, Mr Ronald Reagan was barely ahead of him in Vermont. Mr George Bush held an equally thin advantage in Massachusetts. The ousted Khmer Rouge regime in Kampuchea says it's looking to Australia to help fend off moves to unseat it in the United Nations General Assembly later this year. The Prime Minister of the Government of Democratic Kampuchea has told the ABC's Paul Nokia that continuing Australian support of the Khmer Rouge is vital to prevent further Vietnamese expansion in Southeast Asia.
It's from this base more than 20 kilometres inside Kampuchea that much of the military strategy and political policy making of the ousted Khmer Rouge regime is now decided. It's virtually the seat of government of the Khmer Rouge, the government of Democratic Kampuchea, as its forces try to hold on to small areas of the country from the Vietnamese advance. With two other correspondents, I was invited to the base for long briefing sessions with the Khmer Rouge leadership. The Prime Minister of Democratic Kampuchea, Khieu Samphan, was at pains to stress a switch towards moderation by the Khmer Rouge. The leadership hopes that those policy changes, which included the removal of Pol Pot as Prime Minister late last year, will improve the international image of the Khmer Rouge, an image tarnished by the hardline policies it pursued while in power. The new Phnom Penh administration claims those policies cost the lives of 2 to 3 million Kampucheans. Khieu Samphan denies that. He says the people died at the hands of the invading Vietnamese forces. Foreign Minister Ieng Sari, a survivor of successive Khmer Rouge regimes, admits that the government of Democratic Kampuchea may have a fight on its hands to retain its seat in the United Nations General Assembly when it reconvenes later this year. The leadership says Australia was a great ally in mobilising world opinion against the Vietnamese invasion, and it looks for further support from Australia to maintain its presence in the United Nations.
Malaysian authorities are reported to have arrested more than 100 local fishermen and burned their boats for smuggling goods to Vietnamese refugees living on Bidong Island. 30 Vietnamese have also been arrested in an attempt to stop black market trading. But as the ABC's Peter Monkton reports, it's still business as usual.
The island houses more than 12,000 refugees. As part of its official refugee policy, Malaysia allows no contact between the boat people and the mainland, other than that undertaken by relief organisations. Some of the long-term refugees are already receiving money from relatives and friends abroad. They've become desperate for almost any consumer goods, after existing for months on handouts of basic commodities such as rice, dried fish, salt and powdered milk. The stalls that have sprung up all over the island are a reflection of that demand.
Many of the Chinese among the refugees are enterprising people with a common interest in trading. In fact, some actually said they were quite content working back home in Vietnam, even under a communist government, until such time as private ownership and trading were being phased out.
Here on Bidong, many have set themselves up in quite profitable, although illegal business. However, it's a far cry from the high profits of the old days in Saigon's flourishing business districts or black market. Here, everyone knows exactly what each commodity is worth, and markups are often only a few cents. Money is exchanged, again illegally, at rates not too far from official Malaysian bank quotes. Some refugees still have dollars smuggled out of Vietnam, but few retain any gold after successive raids by pirates. Small boats built from packing cases brave the monsoon seas to bring the refugees fresh fish. The trade goes on undisturbed for most of the time, but occasionally officials swoop on the stalls and everything is lost. Artisans lead a less risky business. There are tailors and watchmakers and bakers who can turn coarse grain rice into flour for delicate rice cakes. But these are luxuries that only those receiving considerable sums from abroad can hope to buy. As in all refugee centres, some of the aid supplies have gone astray. This sugar was meant to be distributed free of charge, but instead it's been sold to a dealer. And in the tough camp conditions, the refugee traders of Bidong Island, perhaps more than anyone else, know the real value of a dollar. This is Peter Monkton reporting from Bidong Island.
The New South Wales inquiry into police administration has heard a call for a major reshuffle of police powers. A submission by the local government and shires associations recommends the creation of an entirely new domestic enforcement agency. The association secretary, Mr Graham Miles, says the establishment of the new force would involve a proper definition of the role and responsibilities of local officers, an adequate training course conducted in conjunction with the police force, and a common, clearly identifiable local enforcement officer's uniform.
We think that the community expects the police to be able to concentrate on the major problems they have, like crime, drugs and so on. So it seemed to us a logical suggestion to make that some of the bottom end, so to speak, of the police activities should be reappraised to see whether they wouldn't be better and more economically done at a local level.
What activities are you speaking of?
We're looking particularly at things like litter, vandalism, local parking offences and the old problem of abandoned motor vehicles.
And to police these matters, what powers would you give local government police?
Probably the powers already exist. If the council staff, the new domestic police force, call it what you like, simply had delegated powers under existing acts, the powers are there. It would be more effective legally, though, to put it into one neat piece of legislation.
The mother of Melbourne's Kisane quintuplets, Dr Josephine Kisane, is expected to go home at the weekend. Dr Kisane has declined any public appearance since the birth of the Quins 12 days ago. The medical director of the Mercy Maternity Hospital, Dr Jim Brainey, says the condition of the three surviving Quins, Mark, Justin and Anthony, is slowly improving. Cricket now, and the third test between New Zealand and the West Indies at Auckland ended in a draw when bad light stopped play. New Zealand was 4 for 73, chasing 180 to win. Earlier today, the West Indies' second innings was declared at 9 for 264. Now the scores in detail: West Indies 220 and 9 for 264, New Zealand 305 and 4 for 73. New Zealand won the three-match series 1-0. In Sydney today, about 100 general practitioners attended a symposium on sleep disorders.
An American expert on insomnia and one of 3 overseas guest speakers, Dr. Thomas Roth, warned the doctors against merely prescribing sleep-inducing drugs to patients. He cited an example where the right dose of a sleeping pill had immediately overcome a person's insomnia, but after 2 weeks' constant use of the drug, the disturbed sleep pattern had returned. Sleep disorders, particularly insomnia, are amongst the most common complaints presented to doctors, and yet few GPs have the knowledge to identify the cause or choose the best course of treatment. Many people have seen some sleep disorders in the past as being emotional or psychologically based. How accurate is that kind of assumption?
That's typically wrong. What happens is, since most of these people have not been treated adequately in the past and have to live with this problem for long periods of time, they develop emotional problems, but typically they're the consequence of the sleep disorder, not the cause of it. So very clearly, many people who have sleep problems are called emotional, but that's inaccurate in many situations.
The federal government wants to deregister the Storemen and Packers Union over the current dispute in the wool industry. The Minister for Industrial Relations, Mr Street, said a short time ago that their strike had dragged on for too long. He said the government would give its full support to any application for deregistration of the union by the wool brokers, a move which should be initiated tomorrow. Australia's latest model cars have been given something of a thumbs down from the motoring magazine Wheels. For according to the editor of Wheels, Mr Peter Robertson, none of the cars released on the Australian market last year was worthy of the title Car of the Year.
What's the criteria that you use to judge the Car of the Year?
It needs to have been a new car which was released during the previous calendar 12 months. It must represent an advance in design, in innovation. It must be a safe car, needs to offer value for money, needs to perform its intended function reasonably well, needs to utilise resources in a responsible manner.
Well, let's run through the top 6. The Falcon XD, what was wrong with that?
The XD is an Indigenous Australian car. It's probably the last Indigenous Australian car. It's a good car. It's not good enough. The steering has limitations. It's too big. The rear seat isn't very comfortable. Turning circle's too wide. It uses too much fuel. The boot's poorly shaped. Doesn't cope with Australian roads very well, rough Australian roads very well.
What about the Alpha Sud Sprint? What's wrong with that?
Well, the Alpha Sud Sprint and the Honda Prelude, same sort of comments apply to them. There are sedan versions of both, and both are very good little cars, which do everything just as well as the coupes and cost a whole lot less.
The Mazda RX-7, why was that eliminated?
It's a fine sports car, uses a rotary engine, wonderfully smooth engine, but still doesn't achieve European standards in its dynamics.
The Renault 20 TS?
Another good car, too expensive in Australia, but it doesn't really do anything that much better than its predecessor, the 16, which was half the price.
The Subaru Leone?
The Subaru was one of the disappointments of the year. We had hoped for a great deal from it. We had suspected it might have been a favourite for the car of the year, but disappointing seats, poor performance, generally a disappointing car.
Well, on that disappointing note, that's where we end our main news bulletin tonight. Be back with our mid-evening news tonight about 9:25. Till then, good night.
Good evening. Hopefully cloud over central and southern Queensland in the next 2 or 3 days will move south into the northern part of the state, and having the right conditions we may see some thundery rain in the north. As I've said, hopefully, but we'll see that in the next 2 or 3 days. But for tomorrow, still remaining hot on the ranges and west of them, and down along the coast, still warm and humid with a few showers on the north coast, and for the central and south coast, some showers tonight and early tomorrow morning, but returning to dry conditions tomorrow. While we're talking about rainfall for yesterday and last night, there was just no rain recorded throughout the state for that period, and today a few drizzle patches along the central coast, but all recordings below 1 millimetre. Overnight minimum of 8 degrees recorded at Cooma, and today out here in the west several centres with 39 degrees, Tibooburra, also White Cliffs and Forbes. Onto the cloud chart, and that's the cloud I was talking about. Already some of that higher cloud is moving into northern New South Wales, but the main body of it with that thundery rain is situated about here, but it'll at least take 2 or 3 days to move southwards, and again, if there's enough feed-in of moisture, we may see that rain falling in the north where it's certainly needed. But for the remainder, these fronts moving through well south of the continent. In fact, some of them are even missing Tasmania. To the surface chart, and what's happening is 2 strong highs down here in the south. They're having a blocking effect on any of these fronts moving through, and as I've mentioned, most of the fronts are moving past Tasmania and down to New Zealand. We've got a trough line down here, and that's the trough line and an upper air low situated about here, which if it moves southwards, as well as a feed-in the next 2 or 3 days of moisture, not only along the coast but feeding in further into the state, then we may see that rain. But for the next 2 days, We're going to see hot conditions out here, a few showers down along the coast, and certainly humid conditions continuing on the coast. So the forecast for tonight and tomorrow for the state: in many areas of the state a very high fire danger, especially west of the ranges. It'll be hot on the ranges and west of them. Sultry thunderstorms in the area just about here, and that's because of that trough line. Fogs down along the ranges and slopes, warm and humid on the coast with some showers continuing up here on the north coast. Winds northeasterly swinging around to the southeasterly in the south. Top temperatures in the regions tomorrow: on the north coast 3 to 4 degrees cooler than today, but in the remainder of the state 1 to 2 degrees warmer. However, in Sydney at 7 o'clock, the temperature still 23 degrees, 3 degrees above normal, humidity high at 74%, winds from the east-northeast and the barometer 1,018 millibars and rising. The forecast: it'll be humid, warm to very warm day tomorrow, 1 or 2 overnight or morning showers and a chance of an afternoon thunderstorm. Moderate northeast to southeasterly winds, a moderate to high fire danger. Temperature range for the city: a warm 22 tonight to a top tomorrow of 27, and in the western suburbs 21 to 29 degrees. Good night.